Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second part in our Power Apps and Flow series. My name is Brian Cowie, the manager of the business productivity team here at Avtex, and I'll be with you today going through the rest of kind of our session number 2. So for those that didn't know, right now, last week, Neil Iverson basically did an introduction to Power Apps. You can definitely, if you had not attended that webinar, you can go ahead and catch that one on avtex.com/webinars. But otherwise, we're right smack dab in the middle where we're going to be focusing on understanding and leveraging some of the information that Neil had from a Power Apps perspective, and then integrating Flow with that and other Office 365 services. So you're right here, right smack dab in the middle. So with that, we're going to at least get started just from a Power Apps primer and saying I'm picking up where Neil left off, where he initially was talking about a travel request process where he was putting together a Power App basically as a mobile application, and I decided to kind of extend that out and integrate it directly inside of SharePoint. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview into what's going on there. So if we quickly go ahead and jump on out, here's my Power Apps landscape, right? So I have a bunch of different screens, from an initial landing screen that comes on board to having a flight screen and a hotel screen and a rental car, as well as a display screen for things that are going on with a bunch of different triggers that basically happen. But what we really have going on is it integrated directly with our travel request list inside of our employee portal here, so that if I go ahead and just do a new item, we basically get my Power App. So for right now, I'll just walk you through what some of the things that we have through here that we'll use as a starting point for an approval process that goes on that hasn't been at least queued up for this yet. So if we just say, yep, our customer is going to go ahead and be Avtex, we're going to say, sure, that's billable, why not? And we're going to say it's the webinar series project, and here is a fun demo reason. Let's go ahead and say that we want to go ahead and have a flight. It automatically throws in today as a departure date. If I want to say, you know what, maybe I don't want to leave at midnight. Instead, I want to go at, 7:35 in the morning from, maybe Delta 134. We're going from MSP to Seattle. We're going to return, maybe not on the 29th, maybe we want to come back here on the 30th. One thing that I did do instead is, just in case people say, I'm going to come back before my departure, I have some conditional formatting in here that basically highlights that, hey, something's adrift, something isn't possible inside of here. So we'll just flip it on back, say that we want to go ahead and return at 9 o'clock at night. We're going to say this is just 4321. Maybe we also want to add an attachment file that has maybe a screenshot of some flight information that's going on. We can go ahead and include that from a SharePoint perspective. Let's say I also need a flight or a hotel, and we're just going to say we want to go at have the Marriott by the conference center, and that we definitely have a corporate rate which flies on out here that says it's just Avtex, but my information is going to be the same as my flight details, and that maybe I don't want to just use Uber, so I'm going to use a rental car. Say it's going to be at the airport, but you know what, maybe I'm going to go ahead and pick that up the day afterwards instead. Right, so just some various information that at least comes in place. I go ahead and hit save, and it's going to submit all that information, really directly into the actual list itself. We can see all of the fields basically being promoted inside of here with the flight information, the hotel information, and so on. And where I really have the approval status, at least initially, as a default value set from a pending perspective. So very traditional if you're used to from a SharePoint perspective, but wanted to show you the direct integration that goes along with that. In addition to it, now if I were to actually go ahead and hit display, it gives me the full-blown view of everything that's been inside of here. If I actually wanted to go ahead and look at the actual attachment itself, I can, dealing with the dates and the AM, PM, and all that kind of jazz that at least go on. So that's the baseline for the starting from a Power Apps perspective. But now let's say we want to add an actual approval process around this and wanting to do it in a modern way utilizing Flow. Let's talk about where Flow comes from and how do we get there, and then we'll actually create the process as it goes on through. So with that, let's talk first on what is Flow. And I kind of identified it as the glue for intelligent process management inside of Office 365. But at its core, it's really intended to allow business users to very rapidly create these automated processes in a secure fashion, and And it really doesn't even have to be just directly inside of Office 365. It can utilize many, many different services for things that are going on. So if we look at the general features from a flow perspective, much like how Neil identified from a PowerApps standpoint, we're dealing with the drag and drop designer. We're dealing with being able to work with flow in many different platforms. So if it is on the web, as I'll be doing here, if it's being able to manage and involve yourself in a process via mobile, or utilizing a bot, or even having hard buttons that can actually initiate flows, all of that is at least possible and capable inside the platform itself. Because it's built on top of the Office 365 and Azure space, we have our built-in identity and security capabilities that we're already known for being able to utilize that platform. There's tons of data connection capabilities, which we'll touch on later on, and of course, many, many native integrations with Office 365. So if you haven't looked at Flow at least beforehand, here's our drag and drop designer, right? So there's a bunch of different things going on here between the flow name that's showing up in the upper left-hand corner. Our flows always start from a trigger. We have scopes that I'll talk about after a little bit, but really then the primary pieces we're working with inside of Flow are going to be dealing with our actions and our conditions, things that need to happen based on various criteria that are actually going on. So the starting place for any process that we're working with is our trigger. And because Flow is native inside the Office 365 space and inside of Microsoft, of course they have those native integrations between Dynamics and SharePoint and Outlook, but they also have things like, what if something happens from inside of Twitter or Facebook or ServiceNow? There's all of these various services and service connections, over 100 plus that are available, that we have the ability to start from. So me being an old school kind of SharePoint guy, we've been used to kicking off all of these flows or all of these business processes inside of SharePoint because that's where we've had our workflow engine. Now we can allow the initiation process to really happen wherever it is that it needs to happen, wherever our users are already entering or processing that data from, and then we can consume that data and be able to pass that information back and forth throughout various services and processes and interaction for things that at least go on. So the trigger is your first important piece that you need to understand how that goes. Along with that, I do have the one icon for PowerApps where you actually can initiate a flow from PowerApps and even send information back into the Power App itself. So the actions are really the key meat, right, of things that are going on. And the action that I'm showing here is starting an approval process where you're just filling out a bunch of different information. I'll get into a lot of the additional kind of markup and dynamic content that goes on, but you can really start connecting a lot of these actions to be able to provide your holistic process. And if it's grabbing some initial set of information from that trigger to be able to add or update information inside of a different system or keep some of that in sync, or notifying different people based on the systems that they're working inside of, that's where the power of the action happens. So really, when you think about what a flow does, really happens as far as what the actions are being concerned with. And then you have a bunch of different other kind of components. Scopes is one thing that I like to use inside of my flow, and it really provides no functional value inside of flow outside of the ability to group common commands together. Because anybody who started to work with a flow that is fairly complex in any nature knows that you can start utilizing your screen real estate really, really quickly. So unless you have a couple 4K monitors, right, that are really good and have a lot of real estate to work with, you may want to consider utilizing scopes to be able to collapse and expand kind of common actions that maybe are going through an initial process. So this one in here is maybe my initiating of my approval process, where I know I need to make sure I get my manager, updating my SharePoint item itself, and then starting the actual approval process. They're all kind of considered not the same action, but grouped together in order to perform that similar action itself. So utilizing scopes, and we'll show you how that works inside the designer here in a little bit. Conditions, of course, are the main primary piece where it really goes down a yes-no branch. So in this case, it's if my response from an approval is approved versus rejected, I'm going to go ahead and do certain actions inside the yes branch and do alternative actions inside of the no branch. But that is really a binary condition based on what a single response or a single value from a given input really kind of comes into play with. So if you need more than that, you can also utilize the switch statements that are in there, where you can once again configure different kind of swim lanes, if you will, based on multiple types of values from a given parameter. So in this case, it's pulling a solution area basically from a dynamics opportunity where I want to do certain activities if it's for business productivity versus a different set if it's cloud solution support. I could have a third and a fourth and a default basically option inside of my switch. So if maybe I'm just setting different variables and then posting the same content farther down, that's also possible for what goes on. And then one of the last things to be able to show before we just get into the actual designer itself is utilizing the apply to each. In a lot of cases, we may be starting to deal with collections of data, and we may need to cycle and perform the same activities on all of those items as they come on through. So if it's going through each response from a Microsoft form being submitted and being able to create a card in Trello, those are all various things that you can do from an apply to each kind of perspective itself. So enough with kind of screenshots for that. Let's go ahead and at least look at an initial flow that's going on. So this is my, hey, I've already created some sort of a flow. This one's not enabled in any way, shape, or form, but I just kind of want to walk through a lot of things that are going on. So my trigger here initially is when a request is being created, and you'll see, you basically need to specify a list name and a site address for where things are basically instantiating from. But what this really means is this flow is going to initiate every single time an item is created inside of that list. Then I basically have this scope called initiate approval, where I'm getting, the person, the requester for this, their profile. I'm then going to throw that person's UPN into the get requesters manager call so that I can get that manager information to use later on. But you can see this scope. If I go ahead and click on it, we'll just expand and collapse this. Like I said, it doesn't do any functional difference to the flow itself, but it lets me collapse that to move on to different pieces. But like if I do my start approval, right, this is where I can start throwing in and using a bunch of additional markdown. But let's say, yep, my initiate approval is all well and good. And now here's my approval response, where if it is approved, I'm going to update that list item. I'm going to send an approval email. I'm going to manipulate some dates because of information being stored in UTC time, which is inside of a different scope that's just doing some UTC conversion. I'm going to go ahead and create a calendar for that person who initially did some stuff. And then I'm going to have parallel branches where, if that was a billable request, I'm going to go ahead and create a planner task inside of my accounting plan that says, hey, we're going to need to create an invoice, throw a delay in here so I can update the actual task, and then maybe even go ahead and post some information inside of Teams. So this instantiates from SharePoint, it communicates through Outlook, and also posts information to Planner and through Teams in a bunch of different aspects. So you can see the power of being able to, now these are all just Office 365 services, but you also have the ability to connect to all other sorts of services as things really go on through. And we'll show what some of those connections are here in a little bit. But this is the general design landscape for how things truly are going on and looking throughout your actual environment itself when you're creating or when you're looking at a flow overall. So we'll come on back to here and jump back to the deck to look at the connections and continue on from there. So our connections area, really it's empowering and connecting all of these different pieces together, because we have the ability to have all of these actions. We're not just, we don't just have the ability to get information from a lot of these other services. We also have the ability to create items, to update items, to even remove items from these various services based on how the actions have been identified. The other beneficial part of Flow is it's not just one instantiation point, right? We have the ability to instantiate from, if it is from Office 365 services or other services, and you can have them either kicked off automatically, like when an item is basically created. You can have it be manual. So maybe you want that item to be created and then maybe some additional changes being able to be made or whatever, and then manually being able to kick off the process. When you manually kick off a process, you also have some alternative opportunities to be able to utilize from a permissions perspective, which we'll also cover later. But you can also have things kind of pre-scheduled on a common occurrence. So instead of maybe having this tied to a SharePoint list where I'm waiting for things to be modified or created, I could say maybe I want to have a flow that maybe pulls a data source from SQL every hour on the hour. I can have a recurrence piece that does that kickoff and does that start, and I don't need to have any user interaction to actually instantiate that actual business process. And along that standpoint, much like with Power BI and Power Apps, I can utilize the on-premise gateway to be able to connect to my internal services. So let's say you're running in more of a hybrid mode where you have only some services in Office 365 and you have other data sources, if it's SQL, if it's SharePoint, if it's even Dynamics from that perspective, on-prem, you can utilize that on-prem data gateway to securely connect from Flow running in the cloud down into your on-premise services to be able to gather that data and utilize it throughout the actual business process. All the actual connections that are available from Power Apps and Power BI are really shared. So as soon as certain connection capabilities or certain services start to become made available in either of those services, they start to light up in the others, which is extremely beneficial as you start looking through that stuff. So really the kind of two areas that I want to highlight as part of it is working with the dynamic content. We can always hard code certain information, like the fact that that you could just always have the title for an approval be pending travel request. But in this case, maybe we want to inject who it was actually submitted by or who it was created for, or being able to into that actual approval piece. If the person just wants a quick set of information to be able to maybe make a decision on, like in this case, being able to show what the reason that the person identified in the form, if they need a flight, hotel, or car rental, having that directly embedded inside of the actual approval piece so that they don't necessarily need to look at the holistic form if they don't need to, and they can make a decision directly in the approval process itself, or provide them a link that goes hard back into the actual form itself to get additional detail if they so need. Now that's going to be just exactly what the values from those various services that you're getting the information back from. But what if you need to manipulate that in some way, shape, or form? We also have the ability to use expressions that are kind of bubbled up from Logic Apps. So if it's doing some concatenation of text, to be able to put that in there. If it's doing string manipulation or doing some logical if this then that kind of components, if it's manipulating math or date times, there's all of these sorts of functions, substrings that are available that you can then once again inject directly into your actual process itself. So now let's start looking at what it means from a creation of a flow perspective. So when we get started, we need to know where we start, right? But this allows us to really instantiate it and interact from the actual process. So we can either create them, right, from the traditional web interface, like what we're going to be showing today. You can technically even create and manage these things from a mobile perspective. So web and mobile are huge. But the problem a lot of the times with people from a business process perspective is looking at a blank sheet of paper and not knowing where to start. That's why there are hundreds of templates that are out there inside of the inside of the Flow site that maybe say, you know what, here's a pre-baked one that'll start from a SharePoint list item being added. Let me send a customized email to somebody. So it already gives you a starting point. But it's not just, once again, these SharePoint services. You can see, if I want to start moving information between Google calendars and Office 365 calendars, or triggering an event from a Power BI data-driven alert. All of these different things are possible, and they have categorized them in such where, these are maybe just some of the productivity ones, but if you want to have some injunction with social media, or just want to look at calendar events or data collections or button flows, all of those things are possible to maybe get your juices flowing and understanding where you can start with to really go on. And it's nice, you can also see from a popularity perspective, a lot of them that have actually gone kicked off. So this is if you're creating them directly from the web interface. Let me start from a place that I need. Well, let's say that I'm inside of SharePoint and like my list, I want to create a flow and directly hook things up from there. The introduction of the SharePoint launch panel for Flow is going to auto suggest to you a bunch of different things and be able to choose, really bring them and integrate them together. So if it's, once again, sending that customized email, if it's starting an approval process, if it's, what we'll start with is requesting manager approval for a selected item, or even posting to teams. They're all different kind of templates you can start from, but instantiating from SharePoint so it already knows the connection needs that you really have from a starting point. And that's where we'll start here in just a second. But if you also want to manage these in a more holistic area, or even just want to interact with these flows in a different place, there's even Flowbot for Teams that you can integrate with. So if you're working in Teams a lot, like myself and my team, we also have the ability, if an approval comes in, I can get notified directly inside of Teams that this is basically going on. I can also create and manage these flows inside of Teams, or have conversations with Flowbot to understand different things that are going on. So that's extremely valuable, as you can see how it's starting to get interwoven between all of the various services inside of 365 itself. So with that, let's get to the meat of this piece and go into actually creating our new flow. So if we jump back over here, right, we have our SharePoint site, our SharePoint environment. We're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new flow from this action bar, where we're going to say create new flow, and it's going to give us our launch panel. We're going to go ahead and get started from request manager approval for our selected item. What this means is it's not going to automatically kick off if a new item is added, but a user is going to have to instantiate it, which is fine by me, at least for this perspective. So if I go ahead and click on that, it says, hey, these are a bunch of different things that I'm going to need. It queues up, I'm going to be needing to connect to SharePoint, Office 365 users, the approval service, notifications, the mail client. All of these are at least in place. Maybe you do, or maybe you don't have connections for this, but let's go ahead and get started. So if we get started, at least for that, we're going to end up seeing that it already throws a bunch of things on the canvas for me. And it says, you know what, maybe I'm going to utilize a lot of the similar or starting pieces that at least go into place right away. So like I'm getting that for that selected item. I'm getting the item so I can start messing around with a bunch of the various data. But now, what if I wanted to manage that scope, right, between the profile and the manager stuff? If I just go ahead using the plus sign, I do add a scope. I'm going to go ahead and rename this just because I want to. And we're going to say initiate approval. And like I said, by itself, it does nothing, right? I can expand and collapse, but I can go ahead, get my profile in there. I can get my manager profile in there. No additional steps on this one. Because we're doing it from a demo and a webinar perspective, instead of dropping in the user principal name from get my profile, so that would send to Neil being my manager, I'm instead going to throw Trevor basically in here so that it's going to send the actual approval to me, even though I'm going to be the one instantiating it. Just something that I want to be able to start off with and get going. But let's even say before those pieces, I wanted to go ahead and update the actual SharePoint list item with information saying who is maybe going to go ahead and actually approve this. So I should probably have the manager first. So I'm going to add the action underneath my get manager. If I go ahead and look at my SharePoint ones, you're going to see there's a ton of actions. There's 28 in general, but what I'm going to be looking for is updating my item. So it goes ahead, it flies the update item directly inside of there. Just for the sake of it, I'm going to go ahead and throw in my actual URL for where it is. It then will show me what lists are there, so my travel request. And I need to identify the ID of the item that I want to go ahead and update. So for that, I'm basically going to just do that off of my get item, because that gives me at least it back. And the important piece to understand here is now it gives you all of the values that are basically available for that given item, including all the default values for any, like all of these are yes, no. So what I'm going to need to do is make sure to override these with the values from my initial piece, as well as, because title is required, it needs me to be able to dump in basically the title field back in here. Otherwise it would fail because it's saying it's required overall. So I don't want to make sure that I update it with billable yes, just in case it's not going to be billable, at least in the first case. So I need to go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and find billable. I'm going to go ahead and find flight, and really just fill out a lot of these different things. Won't take too long. Hotel. rental car different, hotel different, corporate rate if that was a yes or no or not. And then we're going to leave that at least a pending, but inside of our approval information field, I'm just going to say now it's pending approval from, and I want to say the manager display name. So if I go ahead and do manager, so you'll see there's, my profile display name and get my manager display name. This is the other important thing with any of your actions. Whatever you actually call the action is how you can identify and find that information utilizing the actual dynamic content itself. So that's where get manager, get my profile, get item, those are all extremely important for when you go in. And what I'll also end up doing is actually throwing in the actual user principal name for the actual manager, since I wasn't setting that through the Power App itself. So this goes ahead and actually updates the item, so it says it's pending approval. But now what I want to go ahead and do first, you know what, if there's an issue getting the manager information, I don't need that email notification, nor do I need it to terminate at least automatically. We're going to assume everything is nice and happy. So I'm going to go ahead and update my actual start approval component inside of here. And with this, once again, throws a lot of initial information. The approval one, you can say if it's anybody from the assigned list or everybody from the assigned list, which means you can send it to multiple individuals. Well, let's go ahead and say I want to, do this to say pending travel request. And then maybe instead of throwing name there, I want to say for whoever it was that created, right? So this is once again from the update item and from the get item. I probably want to do my created by display name. It probably isn't going to change, but that's what I want to do. One of the things that's also important is on the selected item component, you also have the ability to prompt the person who's initiating it to be able to add an input, and then that input you can utilize later. So in this case, it's called message, and it'll be prompt with, send a message basically to your manager. And that's what it is at least initially put in here. I don't like this replacement thing, so I'm going to throw that away. I'm going to get rid of that description, and I'm just going to call this view travel requests. In here, I'm literally going to just go ahead and use the link to item from my get item right there. And then inside of my message, maybe I want to provide a lot more information utilizing some of the markdown support inside of here. And I'll throw in some placeholders in place that I'll then throw the dynamic content in because it gets a little funky at times or has the ability to. So if I just say a new travel request has been submitted by somebody for, we'll say this customer. And then if I just go ahead and utilize that dash, well, basically means I'm going to get a bulleted list inside of here. And the double is basically going to have a bold and italicized. So if I say this is my reason, and then I'm going to go ahead and put reason in there, we're going to basically say if it contains a flight or not, if this one contains the need for a hotel or not. We'll make sure we put some spaces in these. And then we'll do the last one for car rental. And then just in bold, I'm just going to say, please approve or reject the request, right? And basically finish that off. So now I need to be able to put the things basically inside of my placeholders itself. So once again, if I basically want my rental car, if I want my hotel, if I want my flight, yes or no, and if I want my reason. So, and this one's going to be submitted by, so this is once again going to be by my created by display name. And then for, we said that was going to basically be for a particular customer, right? So now I basically injected all that information directly inside of my start approval. So that's all well and good and set up. Now we basically have our condition for, hey, if it's approved or rejected, right? For things that are going on inside of there. So maybe what I want to do, the first thing that I want to go ahead and do inside of here is I want to update my item. I'm assuming it's basically going to go ahead and be approved. Once again, it brings me to all my SharePoint things. I can then go ahead and type in update so that it refreshes and only shows me the pieces that have update with SharePoint. So now it has the kind of updated item 2 itself. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and copy in my URL. for my list. And what I'm going to say here, instead of update item 2, I'm going to say update travel request, so that that is actually inside of there. I go ahead, dump in that URL, have my name, I get my list ID, my list item ID again, which I want to get from my initial get item. We have to, once again, throw in the required title, right, that's going on. For there, we're once again going to need to throw in these billable things and non-billable things and whatnot. So here's our flight. Whenever we do all these updatings, whenever you have any of those default values, it's another thing you need to very much keep in mind as things go on. So rental car, rental. If we're different here from a rental car perspective, almost there. Hotel, we very much don't want these things to be defaulted to no, especially if somebody put yes in there. Here's our corporate rate. And now, because we're going to say it's basically approved, we're going to say, not only the approval status is set to actually approved itself, but we're then going to go ahead and say, you know what, we're going to put the approval details with the comments that actually come directly from the approval itself. So that's super helpful overall. So now it's at least updated inside of SharePoint, so that's all well and good. But what if I also want to, update the actual email that comes in instead of having it just be generic? Because this is what they put in first. So if I just say, you know what, travel request has been approved, and instead of just saying approver name has approved your blank request, I'll just say travel request. And you can see this is basically set up for it being an HTML email, right? So is HTML is not, so you can have that general HTML markup overall. So then, yep, so that's all well and good. Maybe now that that travel approval is done, maybe I wanted to say, I want to go ahead and create a calendar event to be able to put that on their basically on their calendar, because I already know their flight times, right, that are basically coming on in for the actual environment itself. So if I go ahead and do create event v2, because that one looks even fancier. So my calendar ID, we're going to go ahead and just say, yep, it's going to be coming from my actual calendar itself. We're going to say this is travel for, maybe we just want to throw in there, it's going to be the travel for our customer. We're going to put the departure date in our start time, and we're going to put our return date basically for our end time overall. And obviously there's a bunch of other things that I can do inside of here, and if it's HTML, or add a bunch of other things inside. But at the end of the day, I really just wanted to create that calendar event overall. So that's all well and good, and just saying, sure, I've been responded to, that's all well and good, but what if I want to start getting other people at least involved, like we had in our at least initial example? So I'm going to go ahead, and instead of creating an action, I'm going to go ahead and actually create a condition inside of here that goes ahead and says, you know what, I'm only going to do this if it's billable. So inside of my value inside of here, we're going to go ahead and say, I'm going to do this based on my initial billable, right? If that's equal to, and we're going to actually utilize the expression of true, if it actually lets me kick in there. So choosing said value of, true, good, like it. So now that's at least down inside of there. So if billable is going to equal to true, what I'm actually going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create a scope to create a bunch of planner stuff, right? So we're going to say accounting planner task creation. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and actually, let's just look for things from planner, and we're going to go ahead and create a task inside of that. So we're going to create a task. We're going to identify what plan it's going to be associated with. In our case, it's our accounting plan. I'm going to say this is create invoice for billable travel. Our bucket's going to be our travel billing bucket, because we have that going on. And you know what? Maybe I actually want the start date for when they should be doing this based on their departure and based on our return, right? So you know what? You don't need to do that until they leave, and it probably should be done prior to them basically being due. I'm also going to rename this, because I want to say this is the accounting task to potentially use later on. Now, I also want to be able to add additional details that they don't give me right here, but because I know there's some wonkiness in race conditions that go on with flow, I need to basically throw a quick little 1-minute delay piece inside of here. So if I go ahead, I'm just going to delay for a minute, and we're just going to say delay accounting planner. And then we're going to use the update task details, which comes back to planner. And inside of here, you need to specify the ID of the task that you want to update. So I'm sure that I get an ID back for that task. Yes, I do. Inside of my description, once again, I can add a bunch of information. So a travel request was approved by somebody for somebody and requires invoicing. And as soon as my keyboard catches up to me, so this is going to basically be the display name, right, of who it was actually approved by, right, my manager, or in this case, it's going to be me, for a particular individual. So this is going to be my created by display name, once again. So if I do my created by display name, and then because I want to be nice, I want to also add a link inside of that planner item back to the actual travel request. So if I do my link to item, and I want to get that from my get, that's there, and I just specify the type of other. So that's all well inside of this. So if that's just there, and then you know what, that's everything inside my planner task creation. And just because we want to throw one more integration inside of it, we want to basically go ahead and post a message inside of Teams and kind of go on from there. So this is just going to be our post to Teams. We're going to push this to our Office 365 demo team, which I have set up. This one's for accounting, so we're going to go ahead and push that there. And once again, we're just going to say a billable travel request for somebody has been approved and requires booking. Please view task blah in planner for details and submit and prepare an invoice for a customer. So once again, as that gets hooked up for me, I have my basically placeholders in place. I'm going to go ahead, get rid of that, throw on, I want to get my customer inside of here. We want to please view the task inside of planner. So that's going to be the title for the accounting task. And this travel request was basically for, once again, my created by display name. So that's going to be for this guy. Right, so going at least through here, those are all the things that are transpiring. I'm going to say request manager approval for travel request, and I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And now it's yelling at me saying, hey, wait a second, there aren't things that are going on. I don't want to create a file, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. I'm not sure exactly, I must have thrown that in there by default. So that's all the things that come into play if you're missing information. That goes ahead and actually saves that. That's all well and good. So if I come back over here, I refresh this guy. If I want to go ahead, we actually have our travel request created now. If I now go to my flow action bar, this now has my request manager approval for the actual travel request. So this basically is going to go ahead and initiate the process saying, hey, you're probably the person that's involved. Let me make sure that you have your connections. If I go ahead and continue, and you basically do this for the first time you go through here, this is that message to the manager. So if I just say, please approve, please, and I go ahead and run that flow. With this flow basically being run, if I go ahead now, that's all well and good, that's all done. We'll be able to see that if I come back to my actual flow, we'll see that we have this one component that's running, and we can see the actual action as it's going on through. We see that it's basically hung up on the actual start approval process, at least right now. So for that one, if I come on and grab my email, this is basically what it looks like for, and you see the markup, right? We have our bold for reason, flight, hotel, car rental with the bullets. We have please and approve the reject basically piece for it being in there. I could click on this to get over for there. I'm going to say this is a great idea. Awesome, Brian. Go ahead and submit. So I didn't even need to go back into Flow or go back into PowerApps to be able to get that done. So I'll go ahead and close that, and we'll see that that is now basically completed. It went through, it actually already sent me my email that basically says, hey, Brian has already approved your travel request. That's a great idea, dumping that in. I have a direct link back to my actual item itself. And you can see now that it's basically checking for the, hey, yep, my billable piece is at least there. While that's also going on, I can come back to my actual SharePoint item. If I go ahead and refresh this, we'll now be able to see that all the way over here, now my approval status is equal to approved. My approval information based on what I threw back inside of there is all well and good. And I didn't wait long enough for, basically it's already created that initial accounting task. So if I come back inside of here, if I go back over to accounting, I go over to that accounting plan. So now you'll see there's the create invoice for billable travel. Once that timer is done, it'll also add the additional details to that task and post a message inside of there. So you'll see now there's the link that goes basically directly to that actual travel request. And if I come back here, it is the post that says the billable travel. It's basically been to Brian and it needs to be invoiced to Avtex, which is pretty good, and our flow that really kind of goes on through. So with that, let me at least jump back and we'll get into one last section here as we basically need to. And along with that, I guess the last thing to be able to show is that it did also go ahead and throw a UTC information time basically for my calendar that basically said travel for Avtex. I didn't dump any other information inside my description, but that was actually created as part of that process as well. So let's go ahead and get back into the last thing, which is really talking about permissions overall to basically wrap things up. So we have a bunch of different types of flows. The main ones that you'll probably be working with are your my flows, right? The ones that you are creating, you're the ones that have originated, you're the only one that can mess with it, right? So that's what you first see. Then you have this concept called team flows. So even if you originate the flow and you want to have other people involved with you to be able to manipulate or mess around with it, you can add them as additional owners. And multiple people can be there, but it's also, everybody that is connecting to it can utilize the same data connections that have already been put in place. But so that's at least interesting to understand. The ownership that comes into place, right? If I give ownership rights over to Neil for the flow that I just created, he can then edit, update, delete it. He can assign other owners, even if I didn't want them there. And like I said, utilize all the connections that are in place. So that's ownership. Now, if you're also using, like we set up here, the last thing for that one is owners can be people, they can be Office 365 groups, and fairly new, you can actually set it so that a SharePoint list can be the owner. And that means anybody who has full control of the list automatically gets ownership of the flow, which is also extremely nice from a permissions management. You don't have to manage permissions to say, okay, these set of people have the ability to manipulate the actual form and the list and everything inside of SharePoint, but then these other subset of people can do it inside of Flow. You can just have them all be consolidated together for yourself. Then the other thing is the run-only permission. So if you have a manual instantiation process, you have the ability to set manage-only run permissions. So this is only available, once again, on manual initiations. And for this, the people that you set for run-only rights can run it, of course. They can see the results, makes sense. And they can utilize either connections that you have already put in place, or you can specify that those credentials needed to be provided by the run-only user, which is actually the default if you're doing any manual instantiation. So if you need to make sure that a particular action is actually fired to maybe a place that they don't have access, such as a Teams post, right? Not everybody is probably going to have access to there. Maybe you want to say it's always going to be posted from this account as opposed to the run as user. Same thing with Planner, or same thing with other services as well. So that's important to understand. And once again, users for this process can either be individuals, they can be 365 groups, and the same thing can be SharePoint list or library. So anybody who has contribute rights to an individual item basically would automatically be granted run-only rights, which is extremely cool and beneficial. So if we quickly take a look at that, right, this was my request manager approval for travel request. We can see this is where it's my flow right now because I'm the owner, I'm the only owner. If I want to go ahead, I can, easily say, I want to go ahead and say that employee portal travel request, that SharePoint list now is also an owner of that given flow itself. right? So if I go ahead, basically relook at this, we see now employee portal, travel request is another owner. And I can also do the same thing for manage run only users, where if it's either, once again, a SharePoint, or if I want to say, you know what, Neil has the ability now to be able to run this individually. And I want him to be able to do, to provide all of that various detail itself, but maybe for Planner, I want to be able to utilize my connection because they don't have any access to it, right? So having that ability to be able to save that information all the way through is also extremely important to be able to have in. So with that, let's go ahead and kind of wrap it up. So overall, right, let's look back at what we've accomplished. We've created a flow from SharePoint that initiated from PowerApps. We've utilized a bunch of different services such as SharePoint and the user profile, approvals, email planner, and Teams. We've embedded that information between the services, right? We moved information between the user profile to SharePoint. We've consumed that stuff through email and approvals and planner and Teams, and we've shared that process to the SharePoint list as well as individual people to be able to run stuff up. So I have some content in here for, once again, some guided learning that's available for Flow, basically the support forum for Flow here as well. There's a great community support area as well as their team blog is at least available there. And then otherwise, to join us for our last part in our series, Neil's going to be talking about not just the Canvas apps, right, that we've been talking about between the first two segments here, but really going into data-driven applications utilizing the Common Data Service with Dynamics inside of PowerApps, not next week, but the week after. So with that, I thank you for your time and hope you have a good day.